Yeah, okay.
Hello, welcome to part two of my discussion with Lee Jussim. So Lee, we're back again. Nothing
Hi.
can
Good.
stop this interview because we're both busy men. So yes, back to our point about Asian Americans and discrimination. We're no longer talking about Trump. So there's this study. Study questions bias against Asians in admissions. If only standardized test scores were used to admit students to the most selective colleges, Asian enrollments would increase by just 2 percentage points, researchers say. So, are we exaggerating bias against Asian Americans?
That I don't know. That seems unlikely. At 2%, I mean, it depends on 2% of what. Like, it would increase by 2% of the student body? Well, that might be true, but that might be 20% of Asian applicants or something like that. So I would actually have to look into that.
Yeah, I would have to read the study too. I didn't read it. I just read the article and the headline.
Yeah. As we were having this conversation, I just called up census data by ethnic group, and the top. I'm just looking through like the top 6 or 8 groups. Like 3/4 are Asian. So it's Indian, Taiwanese, Lebanese, which I guess is officially the Mideast is officially Asia. So I'm not sure how that counts. Turkish, Chinese, Iranian, Japanese, and Pakistani. Those are so I like this doesn't mean there is no anti-Asian discrimination in the country. But what it does mean is that people of ethnically Asian backgrounds are somehow navigating around whatever discrimination there is to end up doing by conventional standards, by at least standards of income, very, very well in the society.
Yes, and we know why. Many studies have shown that Asians view success as not ec- intrinsic but extrinsic, in the sense that in order to achieve success, one must work very hard. In other words, you're not naturally brilliant.
Yeah. That's consistent with Sakamoto's work on what does explain Asian success, and that's part of it. He argues there's a fairly pervasive, it may not be every cultural subgroup, but there's a fairly pervasive cultural ethic of hard work and education, and keep your nose to the grindstone and just do what you got to do in order to 100 years ago, they would describe it as bettering yourself. And, the reason they would describe it that way is if you come from a humble background, well, then, yeah, you kind of do have to work harder than other people to lift yourself out of that background. I mean, that's, it's always been that way. And I'm pretty sure it will always be that way.
Exactly my point. So, for example, historically, America selected for highly educated immigrants, especially from the Caribbean. So today, West Indian immigrants are more likely to own property than Black Americans, and they're also richer. Why? Because of selection processes, and furthermore, the ancestors of these people who migrated to America were more likely to be educated, and they also own properties. They own properties in the Caribbean because
Right.
churches assisted them to purchase land, and when they migrated to America, they had more expertise in negotiating with white people.
Yeah. That all sounds exactly right. I mean, it is interesting though. I mean, it does. That history helps explain the relative success of Caribbean immigrants to the U.S. But what it also does is it disconfirms the predictions one would make based on the claim that America in 2021 is a pervasive white supremacy. Because if it was pervasively a white supremacist society, even fairly well-to-do Black immigrants would not be permitted to do well in the country. And we know that that's not true.
Yeah, the systemic racism is is an exaggeration, and we
Yeah,
have
it's an
proven
exaggeration,
this
right? It's
thesis
not.
time and time again.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. It's an exaggeration. It's not that it's completely false. There certainly is a history there, there's also some degree of a present, but it's just not this all-consuming thing that much of the modern rhetoric, especially emerging from the far progressive left, would make it out to be.
So for example, the American South during slavery had an internal marketing system. Slaves could function as entrepreneurs, but we have better data on the internal marketing systems of Jamaica and Barbados. We know the extent to which the enslaved were able to purchase property and improve social mobility. So coming from the legacy of the internal marketing system, Caribbean migrants do have an edge.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that history, and that makes tons of sense. It makes common sense, and that it helps explain the success of Caribbean immigrants is just really interesting. But I didn't know that.
Yeah, so for example, there's a system called Partner. That's a Jamaican system, and there's also something called Susu. They're basically informal financial schemes that are practiced by Caribbean people and some people of African descent. So in America, slaves, I shouldn't say slaves, because at this time they weren't slaves, they were free. But in America, free blacks were forced into sharecropping. In the Caribbean, blacks had no interest in staying on the plantations. So because Caribbean blacks were able to migrate away from the plantations, they would have received an opportunity to improve their entrepreneurial and business skills, whereas Black Americans remained on the plantation, so they're less likely to own property. It's history.
I mean, I'm not an international. Yeah, that's really interesting history. Yeah, I learned something. So that's great.
Yeah, the study was actually done by a Jamaican academic, Eleanor Brown.
Yeah.
And I have a paper on it for Marian West.
Yeah. So, there is an interesting aside to that. I mean, this is why I routinely condemn the excesses of the illiberal left, including in academia. But the left isn't completely wrong. So, the fact that it was a Jamaican who, provided the source that relayed the history that you just described, I don't think it's a coincidence. And that kind of, vindicates to some degree the push for diversity, racial, ethnic, demographic diversity, especially in universities, because when you bring in people from different backgrounds, they really do have different expertises and different ways of approaching the world. And mostly, not counting the illiberal component that sometimes comes with that, but mostly that's a good thing, in my opinion.
But many studies on the Caribbean have also been produced by white men like Michael Creighton and American academics. But I do get your point. Someone outside the region can bring a superior perspective. So, for example, I'm a Jamaican, so I'm in a better position to comment on the political realities of Jamaica. And secondly, 10 men studying for a degree at Harvard who are all from wealthy backgrounds are not diverse. If five yes, so if 5 men are Asians, 2 are blacks, and 3 are whites, that is not a diverse group because they're from wealthy backgrounds.
I completely listen. I came from humble. I grew up in a New York City housing project. So Lipton, I agree 100%.
Yeah, that's not diversity any at all. It's just like when. So, for example, people like to talk about promoting black YouTubers or minority YouTubers. But can you hear me, Lee? Hello?
Oh, you're breaking up again.
Hold on.
Yeah, you broke up. I missed the last sentence.
Okay, so let me continue. So today we talk a lot about black YouTubers and promoting diversity. But if you're a black YouTuber and you're only interviewing black people, you're anti-diversity.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, look, I just personally, my favorite people, whether they're YouTubers or academics, are people who are comfortable being with, communicating with, debating and disagreeing with people from diverse backgrounds. And when I use the term diversity, when my colleagues use it, they usually mean sort of the kinds of demographic diversity to include what are often called marginalized groups in academia. I include that, but my vision of diversity is far more diverse than that. And I think, part of that, and one of the biggest divides, is actually political differences. And, it's very difficult within academia to have a serious discussion across a political divide, because there are almost no people on the right in academia. And I think having those discussions are incredibly valuable. They're fundamentally good for the society. And on top of that, I think they're often really interesting and would improve the quality of social science if more social scientists engaged in them.
I agree 100%. But Lee, now we can talk about some of your serious articles. You did a piece, Microaggressions, Questionable Science, and Free Speech. I don't expect you to summarize all of the document, but tell us, Lee, what are some of your objections to microaggressions, and should we take the concept seriously?
Well, so I'm going to have a hard time answering that, because I have no doubt. At its core, the concept of microaggressions is that people are sometimes subject to, victimized by subtle insults based. Most of the work is based on race, but it doesn't have to be race. It could be based on gender, or really, in principle, sort of any sort of demographic category. So I have no doubt. If you're a functioning person above the age of 10, you probably have been targeted at some point, or seen other people targeted by subtle put downs and insults. Like, this is, as far as I don't know. I haven't lived in other foreign countries, so I don't really know what it's like in Turkestan or Vietnam. But my guess is subtle put downs and insults is a pervasive part of human life. It's certainly a pervasive part of American life. So, everybody's experienced that. Are some based on one's racial or ethnic or other demographic type categories? I have no doubt that that's true also. People are insulting, and when they're intentionally or unintentionally insulting, I think, included in that are racial or ethnic or religious or gender-based or sexuality-based insults. So in that sense, the concept is potentially sound.
Yes.
Right? People, you can see it in life. So it's not completely wrong. Okay, so let's put that over here. There's something to the concept.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the social science on it is terrible. It's just terrible. And it's terrible because if a microaggression is one person subtly insulting another, you need at least two pieces of information. You need information about the first person's behavior or speech, and you need information on the second person's reaction to it. Almost none of the research does that. Almost all of it is entirely the subjective perceptions of the person claiming to have been targeted, or victimized or insulted by a microaggression. And that's okay if what you're talking about are subjective experience. The only person who can describe your or my subjective experience is you or me. But if hypothetically, I could be insulted by you saying the sky is blue. Well, that doesn't mean you saying the sky is blue is an insult. And so that's one major source of the weakness in the work. One of my favorite things to do when I do these critical evaluations of research, and I've done this with lots of things. I've done it with self-fulfilling prophecies. I've done it with implicit bias, is to go to what people tout as the strongest and best work in the area. Because, if the strongest, if what people are touting as the strongest and best work is filled with dubious propositions, weak data analysis, and manifestly either false or just ridiculous assumptions, then it really calls into question the whole body of work. So while we're talking this, I called up one of those papers, this paper by a researcher named Nadal. He's a moderately prominent microaggression researcher. And he did this very quantitative, has all the accoutrements of like hard science analysis of microaggression. And so he develops a questionnaire to assess, well, first place, this build is assessing microaggressions, but it's actually assessing people's perceptions of microaggressions. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But the questions are things like this, and I'm going to read just three of the questions, and then I'll move on. So these are the first three questions. So people are saying how much they agree or how often this happens. They're saying how often this has happened to them. Someone assumed that I would have a lower education because of my race. That's one of the questions. Next question. Someone assumed that I was poor because of my race. Next question. Someone assumed that I would not be educated because of my race. About half or more of the questions start with this, someone assumed. Now, to take this seriously as a scientific construct, you have to assume that people have the ability to read others' minds. Because it doesn't say someone acted or someone said something that communicated. The respondent to the microaggressions questionnaire is attributing an assumption to the person that they're dealing with.
Yes.
And it's just feet of clay at its very, very core.
So
people
Lee,
do not have ESP. Yeah.
I have a response. One, we have actually little data to suggest that people are actually affected by the perception of stereotypes and racism. So for example, a study was done by researchers arguing that the stereotype threat is not replicable. And you cited that study some time ago, maybe over a year ago. So even if the assumption is true, we don't know if the victim is actually at a disadvantage because of the assumption. And my second point is that microaggression may be a useful concept, but not all examples reflect microaggression. So for example, you cite this sentence, how did you get so good at science? A black person asking a white person asking that question to a black person is not necessarily racist. A white person could ask his white friend, why are you so smart? So we're reading too much into simple statements. Secondly, you comment on someone's hair. That doesn't mean that you're racist.
Right. No, you're absolutely right about all this. That you're right on, exactly right on both points. That even if they're true, even if these are racist insults in the heat of the moment or whatever it might be, it really doesn't mean people are necessarily very affected by them. Now they could be, like that's actually an empirical question, right? You can imagine hypothetically a better assessment of microaggressions, a better assessment of the extent to which people are exposed to microaggressions, and then downstream consequences for their health or mental health or or intergroup relations or whatever it might. You can imagine such studies, but those studies have not been conducted. So it's not that we know they have no effect. It's that the research on microaggressions has failed to demonstrate much of an effect. So, and my guess is most people are pretty resilient. Maybe not always all the time, but for the most part. I think that's
exactly
true.
my point. And then in your article, you cited Williams, and Williams got upset because a researcher was criticizing the studies and the field more broadly. And she actually conflated this critique with racism and the dominant narrative and hegemony and all these overrated philosophies. So again, are
Well,
these researchers scientific in the normal sense? Are they taking postmodernist ideas too seriously?
well, I mean, this has become a go-to move within academia. And that is, if you publish, or you're advocating some perspective that seems to be exposing racism or discrimination or sexism or transphobia, such as implicit bias or stereotype threat or microaggressions. So you're advocating or advancing that research, and someone criticizes it or, heaven forbid, debunks it. The go-to move is to accuse that person
Of
of being a
perpetuating
racist.
racism.
Yeah, racism, sexism, transphobia, whatever. I mean, this is like normal in academia at this point. So, and I think in the article that Williams was responding to, I think the author, Scott Lilienfeld, says in the article that this article, the article he's writing, criticizing the scientific work on microaggressions, will probably be interpreted as a microaggression. And he was absolutely right.
Yes. So, for example, Lee, an academic is known for his writings in international relations. His work was criticized by women, and he responded to their critiques. And as such, he was accused of being sexist and just a wicked man or perpetuating the patriarchy because he dared to respond to women.
Yeah. Yeah, this is also very common in academia now, that the social norms about scientific criticism have evolved to reflect what some have called the progressive stack. So if you're higher on the status and power hierarchy, it is counter normative to debate, criticize, disagree, or debunk claims made by someone lower on the progressive stack. So that has become more and more common throughout academia. I'm part of a new initiative designed to fight this. We're in the midst. This is brand new and it hasn't launched yet. A new professional society that will be devoted to open inquiry. And by open inquiry, we mean the full-throated embrace of debate, discussion, skepticism, criticism, and disagreement. And that, you're a racist if you disagree will really not be part of the discussion. I mean, I suppose people will be able to make that, but there's going to be no consequences to those. Those kind of ridiculous.
But Lee, Jussim, I applaud their efforts. I'm actually in the process of starting a HuffPost like YouTube channel for academics. So if you wish, you can create a Zoom file and just send me an email and I upload it. And we do intend to eventually pay our academics, but I won't discuss that. That's part of the business in public. That doesn't make sense. But Lee, your project, I'm assuming that the people who are affiliated with the upcoming project are passionate, right?
Yeah, they are. It's a small group, but yes, they definitely are.
But here's the problem, Lee. I'm really tired of brave people like yourself, like you, starting projects only for these organizations to become infiltrated by those promoting political correctness. So on one hand, we are radical revolutionaries, but on the other hand, some issues should just never be discussed. So for example, so Quillet, I like Quillet, and Quillet started out really good. It's still a good publication, but today Quillet is fixating on transgender issues and identity politics. So Quillet started out to be a game changer, and now it's not as bad as the typical mainstream publication, but I definitely see where Quillet is diverting from its original mission.
That's interesting. I do follow and like Quillette. I can't say I have noticed that, but nor do I follow it that closely.
Yeah, I follow it closely. Originally, Quillette had these really fascinating articles on colonialism, sex differences, many obscure topics. And today, article after article is commenting on the transgender craze or identity politics or systemic racism.
Yeah, as we're talking, I went to the page, and I think you're right. Actually, I mean, here are the current titles: "The Accomplishments of Black Conservative Thought." So, like, that looks. I'm interested in that, but that's absolutely an identity politics type article. There's a toast to Randolph Byrne. I don't really know who that.
Yeah, Randolph
was.
Bourne was a left-leaning writer, was popular back in the day. If Randolph is the person,
racism is a singular cause of racial disparity, why violence and looting have exploded across South Africa. So there is a lot on identity politics. I think you're right. Actually.
Randolph Bourne was a prominent left-leaning academic in his day, but he died as a young man.
Have I lost you?
Hello?
I think the connection got weak for a second.
Yeah, but not a problem. So Randolph Bourne was a prominent academic back in his day, but he died relatively young. He was a writer known for the long form. That's Randolph Bourne. But I really like Quillette. I just wish that they would just stick to their original mission. But back to better topics. You have a piece titled "Is implicit bias training useless?" And I'm going to read 2 paragraphs and then we can jump to something else. Many articles do not define the term. They implicitly define implicit bias as whatever is measured by whatever method we measure it with, most commonly the implicit association test. When articles do define it, the definitions are all over the map. Here are some examples. The idea is that people harbor mental associations based on race, gender, and other social categories that may lead to discrimination without intent or possibly even awareness. Implicit bias can be defined as implicit group-based behavior, which is behavior that is influenced in an implicit manner by cues that function as an indicator of the social group to which others belong. Lee, according to psychological research, we conflate attraction with competence. And interestingly, attractive people can use their looks as a substitute for their lack of qualifications. Bias is a way of life. It transcends racism. Hello? Yeah, Lee? Oh. Lee? Were you here? Can you?
I mean, you're breaking up a little bit, but hopefully you can hear me.
Did you hear my point about bias?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear, but were you able to hear my points about bias?
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Lipton, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
I can hear you.
I'm here.
I can hear you.
Yes, I did.
Oh, so you heard my points about bias and attraction.
Yes,
oh, okay, good. So I don't need to repeat myself.
Okay.
But yes, bias is a part of life.
All right. So I mean, yes, I did. Yes.
Yes, you can continue now. Yeah, Lee.
How about now?
Yeah, you can continue. I can hear you.
All right. There's bias. Yeah, I'm here. Can you?
Yeah, I can. Just speak. Just speak.
All right. So there's bias in this sort of. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes. Just speak. Just speak. Just speak. Just speak.
Yeah, I'm trying to talk here. Okay, so the bias means lots of different things in different contexts. There's bias in the stereotypes and prejudice sense, and all sorts of people are subject to those kinds of biases. So there's biases based on race and ethnicity and religion and gender and social class and age and lots of other things. But then there's bias in the sense of judgment and bad judgment and kind of natural ways that people think that lead them astray. And people are often, and there's really, I mean, Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work exposing the latter kinds of biases. So for example, if people know how something turned out, whether it's a real world event or a political event or the results of a study, if they know how it turns out, they often believe erroneously that they knew it was going to turn out that way. And the reason we know that it's often erroneous that they believe that is there have been experiments where people are asked to predict an outcome, and they're way worse, they're way less accurate at predicting an outcome than they claim they would be after they've heard the outcome. So people, and we're pretty sure that people are not really aware of those biases. So in some sense, you could call those implicit biases. That is, they're biases that are implied by people's judgments, behavior, and decision-making, and they're also likely biases that people are not aware of. But that's not usually what the term implicit bias refers to. The term implicit bias usually refers to something like unconscious racism and sexism. And the work on that is exceedingly dubious. And the reason I started my blog with those definitions is because the definitions are all over the map. And if scientists can't agree even on what implicit bias is, then as a field, we're kind of incoherent when we even attempt to talk about it.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
We know that being an individual requires us to exercise judgment. So you can never get rid of discrimination. And then one cannot be subconsciously biased, yet he's told to change his persona by becoming less racist, though he's not aware of his racism. It doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, yeah, right. It doesn't make any sense. And you know, what's worse is that, I mean, the IAT, the implicit association test, is the workhorse measure. It's used in thousands and thousands of studies. And slowly, you know, especially over the last 15 years, but it's kind of accelerated over the last 5 or 7 years, expose and after expose of weaknesses, errors, illogic in either the use of the IAT or in the linkage of IAT results to conclusions have been exposed in paper after paper. I mean, I created a repository that now has over 30 papers, all criticizing or debunking claims about implicit bias based on the IAT and other measures of supposed implicit bias. So, you know, if the measures don't do what they're supposed to do, then the conclusions based on the research that uses them can't possibly be justified. Which means the bottom line there is that the social sciences actually have created far less actual knowledge about implicit bias than they have claimed.
Exactly my point. And then there's the study done by Philip Techlock and co-authors noting that implicit association tests cannot predict discrimination. So the data and studies are overwhelming.
Well, so that goes a little too far, even in describing their study. And I know people often cite it that way or describe it that way. That goes a little too far. That is what they found, and what most subsequent research has found is not that the IAT fails to predict discrimination. It does predict discrimination. It does so at above zero levels, but the extent to which it does so is very, very small. It's not zero though. So, you know, if the IAT predicts, you know, I mean, I have to get slightly statistical, the correlations of IATs with measures of discrimination or bias are kind of in the 0.1, 0.15 kind of range. That's detectably non-zero. It's just very small.
Yeah, and but again, it's confirming that the idea of IATs is exaggerated. So even if it is a useful concept, researchers are not doing their job properly to convince us to take them seriously.
Well, right. I mean, I think that's true. And I think it's poorly understood in many ways. Now, you can get a correlation with, let's say it's a study of racial discrimination, because that's where a lot of the controversies are. You can get a correlation of the IAT with a measure of racial discrimination with no anti-Black discrimination. And this is not hypothetical. There's an early study of this by researchers named McConnell and Liebold, who found a correlation of about 0.3 between IT scores and racial discrimination. And that makes it look like a pretty substantial ability to predict discrimination. But when you looked closely at their data, which a team that included Phil Tetlock and Hart Blanton and others, when they looked at their data closely, what they found was that the main reason it correlated with discrimination was that people who scored what IAT researchers would like to claim is very low or egalitarian, with very low IAT scores, their behavior was actually pro-Black, that it was more benevolent to it was actually a Black experimenter that they interacted with than they were towards the white experimenter. So what they had was the IAT at low ends corresponded with essentially anti-white discrimination, and high scores that supposedly reflect anti-Black racism corresponded with egalitarian behavior. So because there was a relationship, low scores, anti-white, high scores, egalitarian, the IAT predicted discrimination, but it predicted discrimination in this particular study with literally no anti-Black discrimination.
Yeah, quite hilarious. But Lee, there's another interesting phenomenon that's taking place. Study after study is revealing that diversity programs are not working. And in some cases, diversity programs have created a backlash. Remember, Lee, people are human beings. You cannot just program them to be diverse. You can't just say, okay, yeah, you can't just program them to be diverse. It's natural evolution. You go to the park, you meet a Black person, you meet a Chinese person, and they become your friends. You cannot program diversity.
Well, so again, that may be a little overstated. So what is true is that diversity training programs, the implicit bias training programs, other kind of training programs, are almost completely ineffective and may produce backlash. Because really, if you're some sort of professional, I mean, even a mid-tier professional, if you're, like an administrator in a university department or in the HR department of some major corporation, who wants to spend 3 or 4 or 5, you want to do your job. You don't want to spend 4 hours being trained in some way. On the other hand, there is, the evidence does say that when organizations hire diversity administrators to kind of oversee the increasing diversity, incentivizing diversity within the organization, that seems to produce benefits. Actually, that seems to succeed without producing the backlash and to actually help diversify the workforce. So it's not, it's more of a mixed bag. It's not like diversity programs are always ineffective or counterproductive. Diversity trainings are ineffective or counterproductive, but some level, certain kinds of programs actually do appear to be fairly effective.
Yeah, I believe if we're interested in promoting diversity, the program should be geared to investing in intellectual diversity and ideas. Change mindset, then you change people.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree that at minimum that should be in the mix and on the radar. I think, in the institutions that these programs are most likely to be installed in, academia, big tech, media companies, that the term diversity now means demographic diversity.
Exactly.
That it doesn't include cognitive or intellectual or political diversity. So it's just, in the places that are installing these things, that's not, I don't see it happening.
And again, Lee, there's a difference between diversity and inclusion. So if the workforce is diverse, is it inclusive? Are we taking into account the opinions of diverse personalities? That's a different issue, a completely different issue.
Yeah, it is a different issue. And,
Yeah.
there are, I mean, I think of these things, diversity and inclusion in particular, as having two versions. There's the honest version, in which diversity and inclusion means what it says. That diversity means diversity. It includes, but isn't restricted to demographic diversity. I mean, that's what diversity means, right? Variety, lots of different kinds of people. And inclusion means we welcome them all, even if things about them piss us off, right? That's what inclusion. So that's the kind of honest version of diversity and inclusion. But then there's the sort of ideological version, in which some people are more diverse than others, and inclusion means we're gonna punish all the wrong people so that we can have an inclusive environment for the ones who are left. and the two meanings are disturbing. There's almost an Orwellian characteristic to the two ways in which the terms can and sometimes are used. And I thoroughly endorse the earnest and honest way in which they're used. And I thoroughly reject the dishonest and Orwellian manner in which they're used.
Yeah, so for example, Lee, I'm not one to brag, but maybe my show on YouTube could be the most diverse channel. I've interviewed mainstream academics like yourself and people like Kevin MacDonald. And interestingly, the interview with Kevin MacDonald did not even mention Jews because I'm a very serious person. I like academic research. I'm not into personalities. So I can interview someone who's radical and make him look very moderate and boring.
Yeah.
But the last question is this, and please be brief because we're wrapping up. Are stereotypes accurate?
Well, so right. Can I be brief? The answer depends on how you define a stereotype. So if you define a stereotype as a belief about groups that is inaccurate and drenched in prejudice and designed to justify inequality and oppression, well, of course, those stereotypes are not inaccurate because you've defined it that way. But another way to you could define stereotypes completely differently in a scientifically and politically neutral manner as people's beliefs about groups. Now, if you simply define stereotypes as people's beliefs about groups, it then becomes a question: how accurate are stereotypes? Becomes a question you can assess empirically. It's not preordained by definition. And when studies have done that, overwhelmingly, not always, and there are some notable exceptions, but overwhelmingly, the studies that have been done have found that people's beliefs, especially about demographic groups, race, sex, age, are at least, the accuracy, there's like perfect, sometimes when people use the term accuracy, they think of it as perfect accuracy. So if you ask me, what is the temperature going to be, the high temperature going to be tomorrow, and let's say the actual high is 85 degrees, unless I say 85, I'm wrong. But that's not my view. I mean, if you ask me what's the temperature going to be, and it turns out that it's 85, and I say 84 or 83 or 86, like that's pretty close. I mean, it's not like I'm guessing 18 or 130. So those kind of estimates are more right than wrong, even though they're not perfect. So in that sense, the work shows that people's beliefs about groups are usually fairly accurate. They're almost never perfectly accurate, but they're usually pretty good. There are two notable exceptions. The two big exceptions are people's beliefs about national stereotypes. So just hypothetically, if people believe Germans are efficient, there's really no evidence that Germans are any more efficient than French or Italians or Nigerians or Costa Ricans. So the national stereotypes the evidence on that is they're generally pretty inaccurate. The other big exception is actually political stereotypes. And political stereotypes aren't completely wrong. People know the differences between liberals and conservatives or Democrats and Republicans, but they really deeply exaggerate those differences. And the main reason they exaggerate differences is people often presume that the people on the other side are more extreme than they really are. So people exaggerate political differences.
Yes, but back to your point on Germans. Germans are relatively efficient based on data examining their manufacturing and small businesses. And secondly, Protestants may work harder on average than other groups. So we have data to suggest that there is a kernel of truth to the efficiency of Germans and Protestants. And also, Americans work really, really hard. They're workaholics. We do have data on this topic. Yeah,
Right. So there's there's difference between, and this is actually not well captured in much of the attempts to scientifically study the accuracy and inaccuracy of stereotypes. What's not well captured is that there's a difference between what the people are like as individuals and how the society or country functions as a culture or nation. Those are not the same thing. So Herman, the Herman in Germany may not be any more efficient than Bob the American or Luigi the Italian. But that's a different question than whether the German economy or the German government functions efficiently. Yes. And it may well be that when people are asked about Germans or Nigerians or Vietnamese or Cambodians or whatever, that they're thinking about the functioning of the country rather than the personality of the individuals.
Exactly. But our conversation, Lee, was very interesting, and I'll have to let you go. Had it not been for that technological glitch, we would have completed the discussion already. But I could not select another date because I have a lot of stuff doing, like yourself.
Yeah, and no worries, Lipton. This has been a great conversation.
Yes.
I'm really glad you persisted through our technical difficulties.
All right, bye.
Okay, bye-bye, Lipton.